Voting is an act of trust. I want you all to think about the last time you voted. I'm going to assume that this room votes, okay? If you don't, you should. So think back to the last time you voted. In 2018, I went to my local polling station, something that I actually hadn't done in a very long time. I voted, I selected my candidates, I put it in the ballot box, and I walked out. In 2016, I wasn't able to go to the polling stations. I was 40 weeks pregnant. My daughter was literally due on election day, so she has no choice now but to become a political scientist. And so I voted by mail, not wanting to risk the fact that I might not be able to vote in person. And so that required me to fill out my ballot at home and send it off in the mail. 2 previous presidential elections, I voted in from a foreign country and submitted my ballot via mail across the Atlantic to wherever it landed. Now, what I want to submit to you today is that each of those acts was an act of trust. Even as a political scientist, I still don't really understand the process by which my ballot makes its way to the final vote count. We know how a bill becomes a law, but we don't really know how a ballot becomes a vote. Now, thinking about the 2016 election, I couldn't believe it when I heard that Trump won. Now, this isn't just like a, OMG, I can't believe it. This is, I really couldn't believe that he won. Accepting the results of an election is also an act of trust. This is what I study. I study trust in elections and why people may or may not trust the outcome. So there are 3 basic reasons that we've come to describe why some people trust elections and others don't. The first is expectations. So we knew before the 2016 election that there was a low probability that Trump might win, but a low probability doesn't mean no probability. So if you have high expectations that an outcome is going to be in one direction, but you observe the opposite, reconciling that worldview can be difficult and can lead to lower trust. The second thing that can affect people's trust in elections are institutions. People may not trust the electoral process. They have doubts about the fairness of the electoral playing field, and this can cause them to doubt the ultimate outcome. The third reason is vote choice. If I support the winning candidate, I think the world has never been rosier. I completely trust what just happened because it conforms to my worldview. But if I support a losing candidate, I have a more difficult cognitive process to go through. I supported a losing candidate, but before they lost, I thought they were the best thing in the world. I thought everyone else around me must also think they're the best in the world. And so when I see a result that doesn't conform to that worldview, I think there must have been something wrong with the process that generated that result. So these 3 things have been present in the research on trust in elections for some time. And my work has now evolved to introduce a 4th factor. And of course, being at GPS, that factor is international relations. So I study how foreign countries can influence trust in elections. The reason this is so important is because there's a commonality of distrust across democracies in the world. Places where elections are very uncertain, have a history of fraud, people there are much less likely to trust elections than in other democracies. And international actors can actually do things to improve confidence in elections, like send international election monitors, which go around the world and monitor over 80% of elections in democracies today. On the other hand, we know democracies are vulnerable. They are vulnerable to international influence, and international actors can do things to influence those elections and destabilize trust in the system. Now, the United States in the 2016 presidential election experienced one of its first episodes of meddling in a long time. But of course, it wasn't the first in the US history of democracy. The first presidential election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson actually experienced profound international influence, specifically from the country of France. France was very interested in having a US president that would be allied to its interests. They noticed that Thomas Jefferson could be that friendly president. So what did they do? They released Adams' emails. Just kidding. But they did do something akin to what Russia did in the 2016 election. They tried to spread misinformation. They tried to use the media to influence the American electorate, even in the 1700s. What they did was they published op-eds in newspapers in Pennsylvania, which was the state that they thought would have one of the biggest influences on the election. And they tried to make the case that if the American public did not select Jefferson, that France was going to have a real problem with it. So even at the origins of our democracy, and at the origins of democracies all over the world, there is a problem with meddling. Now, my work tries to link meddling to trust in elections, and in particular, how meddling can interact with those factors that I explained at the beginning: expectations, institutions, supporting the winning or losing candidate. Now, what my research has found is really troubling for democracy. We know that losers have less trust in elections to begin with. Even if they have some trust, they're very uncertain about whether they should be trusting the result. And it turns out that meddling has the worst effects among losers. Now, the reason this is problematic is because democracy only works if losers consent to be governed by the rulers, or winners. We don't like to call them rulers. But if the losers aren't able to trust the results of the election, they're less likely to consent to be governed by the winners, and this risks the whole system falling apart. So what do we do about it? I think if you live in the United States, we're all looking for how the winners of the 2016 election are going to respond to meddling. And what we're seeing is somewhat troubling, but it is consistent with what we know about the psychology of individuals. So winners don't have an incentive to acknowledge that meddling even happened, and they definitely have an incentive to downplay that it happened, because it undermines the legitimacy of their election. This is exactly what we've been seeing even in recent days. Jared Kushner has gone on some of the morning shows last weekend and said meddling was only a couple of Facebook ads. Independent observers would suggest that actually meddling was much more widespread and more problematic for the election. But my research shows winners have every incentive to do this. At worst, though, winners might actually have incentives to normalize meddling. And this poses an even bigger problem because it actually invites future meddling. It invites foreign countries to undermine the will of the people. Again, we've seen this happen even just in recent days. Rudy Giuliani went on some of the morning talk shows and basically said he didn't see anything wrong with accepting information from the Russians. So the problem is that we have to convince winners that they need to go against their best interests, but act in the interests of democracy as a whole to respond vigorously to meddling when it happens. So hopefully my future work will shed light on how we can incentivize winners to take those steps. Thank you very much.